If you ever find yourself up in the hills after dusk, remember, be cautious, show respect, and above all, don't go near the bones. When I first heard that, I figured it was just the usual local superstition. I'd recently moved to a quiet village tucked away in the Rocky Mountains, hoping for a change from the bustling cities I'd known all my life. The idea of having a forest for a backyard and neighbors spread out miles apart sounded just right. That's why I bought the place. The house was charming, though it had its quirks. The porch creaked, and the kitchen felt a bit cramped for my taste, but it had character. Quaint was the word the agent used as she showed me around. But the real reason I got it was the stretch of woods that would be all mine. I remember my first visit to the nearby town at the mountain's foot. It was one of those places where everyone knows everyone. A few folks were unsure about me, but most were friendly, asking the usual, where I was from, what I did for a living. The grocery store owner, Mr. Faraday, struck up a conversation as he bagged my items, asking if I'd be hiking in the forest. Of course, I replied, chuckling as he looked me over. Silly question, he agreed, handing over my bags. Just make sure you're home by sundown. Out here, it gets dangerous with the wildlife, and you might get lost if it gets too dark. Anything specific I should worry about? I asked. Well, we do have black bears, but usually they'll bolt if you shout. We also get moose, wild boar, and even a wolf now and then. I paused, surprised. Wolves? I thought they weren't here anymore, I said. Mr. Faraday just shrugged. Well, they shouldn't be. Anyway, just be respectful of the place. Don't go picking things up or messing around. I nodded, mostly out of politeness, though I assumed he was being overly cautious. The first few hikes went just fine. I'd go in the morning, follow a trail behind the house that was slightly overgrown but easy enough to navigate. There were birds, small animals, and interesting plants. I kept my hikes short and made sure to bring water and good shoes. But as the seasons changed, I started hiking in the late afternoons. As I wrapped up my hikes, the sun would cast its last light, painting the sky in pinks and oranges. But then little things began to happen. Trees with deep scratches, birds going quiet at the start of my hikes instead of the end. I brushed it off as seasonal changes, longer nights, shorter days. I'd only get about a mile into the woods before turning around, especially since locals had started warning me to be extra cautious. Then one day, I found a deer skull right in the middle of my path. It looked old, cracked, and weathered. I called out to see if anyone was nearby, but got no answer. Unnerved but unwilling to leave it there, I used a stick to move it off the trail, then hurried home. That night, I was jolted awake by the distant sound of howling. It was eerie, long, drawn-out howls echoing through the silence. I hadn't heard wolves here before, and it left me uneasy. I eventually turned on some music to try to drown it out. For several nights after, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the howling persisting until I finally took to sleeping with music on. When I asked about it around town, everyone shrugged it off. Not long after, I found another skull on the trail. A moose this time, antlers and all, looking freshly placed. I stared into the trees, hoping to spot whoever was messing with me, but saw only shadows and branches. I ignored it again and kept walking. But when I came across a third skull days later, I threw it as far as I could. The moment I got home, I locked every door and window, trembling as I peered outside. That night, the sound of something heavy creaking on my porch woke me. My heart raced as I lay still, then heard a low, menacing growl outside my window. I couldn't see it through the curtains, but I heard it clearly, an unnatural, almost human-like noise. It grew louder, filling the air with a high-pitched laughter that sent chills down my spine. I finally fled to the bathroom, locked the door, and waited until daylight. The next morning, I found my porch littered with bones. Some white, others decayed, one even red-stained. Among them was a human skull. I carefully stepped over each one and drove back into town, heading straight for Mr. Faraday. When I told him, his face fell and he shook his head. "I told you not to touch the bones," he said gravely. I asked what I should do, hoping he had some way to fix this. He gave me instructions. Buy raw, bloody meat, leave it on the trail at sundown, then get home and lock up and don't look back. I followed his instructions that evening. The trees seemed scratched up even closer to my home, and the setting sun cast strange shadows around me. I placed the meat on the trail and turned to leave when I heard that growl again. Heavy footsteps followed, and I ran all the way back, barely slamming my door shut in time. Whatever it was had followed me, pounding against the door. I locked myself in the bathroom until morning. The next day, Mr. Faraday told me the townsfolk had heard the noises too, and that I'd stirred up trouble. They were gathering a hunting party and expected me to join. Now, as I sit with a shotgun, learning to load it and keep it steady, Mr. Faraday tells me to stay close. The creatures collect the bones, and they don't take kindly to strangers, he says. I'm leaving this account here in case I don't make it back. The townsfolk will say it was just a hunting accident. The sun's setting now, and I can already hear the laughter echoing through the trees. I live in New York City, but my grandparents are way out in rural West Virginia. When I say rural, I mean the middle of nowhere. Their closest neighbors are over an hour away in a small town with just a few houses and a Walmart. Last summer, my grandfather, who I'll call Robert for privacy, had hip surgery. Most of my family is on the West Coast, and my grandmother, who I'll refer to as Helen, is elderly and wouldn't have been able to take care of Robert on her own. Since I was the closest family member, they asked if I could come help him out, and I agreed to stay for a couple of weeks while he recovered. Everything was going smoothly during the first week. My main duties were helping my grandfather up and down the stairs and walking his dog, a blue heeler named Duke. Normally, Robert would walk Duke twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, along the trails behind their property. But because of his surgery, that job was mine. I've always been uneasy about those woods behind their home. Even as a kid, when my cousins and I would visit, those woods gave us an eerie feeling. For the first few days, walking Duke at night was all right, although a bit unsettling. Then, about a week into my stay, I was walking him around 8:30 p.m. The sun was setting over the mountains, casting long shadows. Suddenly, I heard a strange whistle that sounded like it was about 20 yards away. Duke and I both froze, staring in the direction of the sound. I pointed my flashlight toward it but saw nothing. Figuring it might be a bird, I tried to brush it off, though it sounded much more like a human whistle than any bird I'd heard. Duke was visibly on edge, growling and backing away. Then, whatever it was whistled again, and Duke went wild, barking and pulling to get away. That was it for me. I pulled on Duke's leash and we ran straight back to the house. When we got back, I told my grandparents what happened. They both seemed uneasy, and my grandmother immediately asked if I'd whistled back. I told her no, and she seemed relieved, but then told me not to think about it too much and to ignore it. I asked why, but she wouldn't explain. She just kept saying I hadn't heard anything. Confused and a bit scared, I went to bed, wondering why she seemed so shaken. The next morning, she told me I should just take Duke on laps around the house instead of going into the woods. I didn't argue. Every evening after that, I walked Duke around the house about 50 times before going back inside. Then, on my second to last night there, as I was walking Duke around the house like usual, I heard that same creepy whistle, this time right behind the detached garage, which was only about 10 yards away. Without hesitation, I took Duke back inside and locked the doors. For the rest of the night, I put in my earbuds and tried to tune out any sounds, just like my grandmother had told me to. To this day, I still don't know what was making that whistling sound in the woods. Some friends said it might be a skinwalker, though that's not common around here. My girlfriend, who was back in New York, asked her parents, who are from Yemen, and they said whistling at night can be a sign of a jinn nearby. Whatever it was, it really spooked my grandparents. I've heard of strange things happening in Appalachia, but this was my first encounter with something so eerie. Has anyone else experienced something like this? I once had a close friend who was a dedicated hiker. Let's call her Lisa to protect her privacy. Lisa spent most of her free time exploring trails around the Appalachian Mountains in parts of Tennessee and North Carolina. Regardless of the season, she was always outdoors hiking. One summer, she decided to take a few weeks to hike the Appalachian Trail. She didn't plan to do the entire trail, but wanted to start from Springer Mountain in Georgia and finish at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. I fully supported her and encouraged her to go for it. I even helped her pack and arranged to meet her where the trail crosses through Newfound Gap in the Smoky Mountains. I planned to bring her supplies and join her for a few days of hiking when she got close to where I lived. The day came for Lisa to start her journey, and I drove her to the trailhead, dropping off an excited and determined friend. During the first couple of weeks, I received postcards from her as she stopped to pick up her pre-planned packages of food and gear. She wrote whenever she could, assuring me she was safe and making good progress. As July approached, we prepared for our meetup. Before she left, we had calculated when she'd arrive at the backcountry shelter we planned to meet at, settling on July 10th. She promised to send me a postcard from her last supply stop before our meeting, and true to her word, I received one. It said she was feeling great and was on track to meet me at Mount Laconey Shelter on July 7th. The postcard arrived on July 2nd. We were planning to stay at the lodge for a night to relax and have dinner before continuing along the trail. Mount Laconey Lodge is a popular spot in the park, and you have to reserve a place months ahead to ensure a night's shelter. Knowing this, Lisa was very mindful of our schedule. I gathered the supplies we'd need and had my boyfriend drive me to the trailhead. He was gonna hike with me to the shelter and then head back after we met up with Lisa. We had a wonderful hike up, taking in the breathtaking views of the Smokies despite the steep climbs. By mid-afternoon, we finally reached the shelter, expecting to find Lisa waiting. We were running an hour or so behind schedule, so we went to the front desk to ask if she had checked in, but found out she hadn't arrived yet. We didn't worry too much since it's hard to predict exact arrival times in such a setting. So we settled into our bunk, went up to the lodge, had some coffee, and read while we waited. But by sunset, Lisa still hadn't shown up. That's when I started feeling uneasy. My boyfriend and I walked to the office and asked again if anyone named Lisa had tried to check in, but no one had. We returned to our bunk, and my boyfriend tried to calm my nerves as my anxiety grew. "She's probably behind schedule," he reassured me. "These trails reach the highest points of the Appalachians. She may have just worn herself out and slowed down." His words helped a bit, but it was a long, sleepless night for me. The next day, she still hadn't shown up. We waited at the office for hours, but there was no sign of her. Around 2 p.m., we decided to hike down the trail in the direction Lisa was coming from, leaving word at the office to let her know we'd be back if she arrived while we were gone. When we returned at 5 p.m., she still hadn't been there. That's when things got serious. To keep it brief, we had to leave the lodge and go home, leaving contact information for the staff to let us know if she showed up. Days passed and still nothing. The police were notified, and large search parties, including rangers and volunteers, combed the area between her last known location and our meetup spot. Almost a week and a half later, they found her, injured and starving, in a ravine about 30 miles from the trail and the shelter she had last stayed at. A day later, I was finally allowed to see her in the hospital. She hadn't told the police anything about what had happened and hadn't spoken at all, for that matter. It took her years to tell me everything she had gone through, including parts she never shared with anyone else. The experience had scarred her deeply and made her stop hiking altogether. I'm not sure if she would be okay with me sharing this, but I want people to be aware that this kind of thing happens, and it's something to watch out for when hiking in remote areas like the Smokies. I'll recount her story as closely as I can remember, using her own words as best as possible. She left the shelter around 8 a.m. on June 30th and hiked most of the day, making great time. She was resting and snacking in the late afternoon when she first heard it. The sound of men's voices in the distance. She assumed it was just some guys passing by on the trail, so she didn't think much of it. But after 15 minutes, nobody appeared, even though the voices kept fading in and out. Feeling uneasy, she eventually brushed it off, figuring that after hiking alone for so long, her mind might be playing tricks due to the lack of human contact. When she finally reached her campsite as the sun was setting, she set up her tent, hung her food to keep it safe from animals, and settled into her sleeping bag to read. But then she heard the voices again, louder this time. She could faintly make out thick Appalachian accents, though the conversation was still unclear. She expected to hear footsteps approaching her site, but they never came. Trying to calm herself, she convinced herself it was just her imagination, and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, she woke to find her food wrappers scattered around, all the food missing. Oddly, her backpack was zipped up with no visible damage, leaving her to wonder if someone had opened it. Shaken, she packed up and kept moving, hiking faster in the hopes of leaving the strange voices and odd happenings behind. Hours later, though, she heard the voices again, this time following her steadily. She kept looking over her shoulder, but no one was there. When she reached her next campsite, she decided not to stop, fearing for her safety. She walked through the night, using her flashlight as a guide, until the voices finally faded. At some point, she came across a clearing and decided to rest for a bit. Just as she was setting her things down, she heard the voices again, this time right behind her. A rough voice called out, "There she is!" She spun around, shining her flashlight on two men, unkempt, dirty, and with sinister looks in their eyes. She bolted back along the trail, hearing their bare feet pounding behind her. Once she was over a hill, she cut off the trail and ran through the woods, hiding in the trees and brush. For the next 2 weeks, she managed to evade them, though she occasionally caught glimpses of them, overhearing their disturbing conversations. Eventually, a park ranger and some volunteers found her, and she was taken to the hospital. After being home for a while, she did some research and learned that there were people who hid out in the mountains, avoiding the law due to crimes they had committed. These people, sometimes called wild men, live isolated lives to evade authorities. After hearing her story, I barely go hiking anymore. They likely aren't the only ones out there, and if you ever go hiking in remote areas, be aware and keep a close eye out. I grew up in West Virginia but moved around a lot as a kid, between the Appalachian Mountains and the Midwest. From ages 10 to 13, I lived in a small town called Hollow Creek, Kentucky, nestled in the foothills of one of the world's oldest mountain ranges. I lived with my dad and grandma in a little cul-de-sac between the hills. We were in the middle of the neighborhood, with family living on either side of us, but no one across or behind us due to the hills. When I moved in, my grandma had some rules I had to follow. At the time, I thought they were just local superstitions, stuff like don't mess with wild animals, don't go into the woods alone, and some stranger ones like, if you hear your name, don't answer, and if you see someone in the woods who looks familiar, no you didn't, just go home. This particular experience happened in August when I was 11. My dad and I had mowed a path through the tall grass and berry bushes next to our double-wide trailer. We often camped out there since it was close enough to check on my grandma if needed. When you're in the woods, everything seems louder than you expect. Bugs, animals, the wind in the trees. There was also a small stream that ran along the road, which you could always hear. That night, we had a campfire going, adding to the usual sounds. My dad went back up to the house, which was about a quarter-mile away, to grab more beer and check on Grandma. Before leaving, he told me not to mess with the fire. After a few minutes, things got really quiet, too quiet. The wind died down, and all the usual sounds of animals and insects disappeared. Even the stream seemed like it was far away. I started feeling uneasy, even though I had been left alone at the campsite before. Then I noticed it. A strange metallic taste in the back of my throat, like something burning. Just as I was getting really spooked, my dad returned. He was angry right away, saying he could smell something like burning metal as he walked down the path. He accused me of throwing beer cans into the fire, but I hadn't. I even showed him the cans, untouched. He let it go after saying a storm was coming, and we needed to get back to the house. We left the tent and started heading back. One strange but cool thing about being in the woods during a storm is how lightning can light up everything, making it look like daylight, but only for a second. After that, it's pitch black again. There aren't any streetlights, so unless you have a light on your house, it's completely dark. It was drizzling lightly, and except for the dim lights from our house, the night was totally black. As I was eating some watermelon, as you do in August, a flash of lightning lit up the area, and I saw something. It was standing on the porch of a house across the stream, past the road, beyond the first row of trees. I couldn't see it clearly, just a silhouette, but I froze. The next flash of lightning revealed it was closer, standing right by the trees. I panicked and ran inside. My grandma was doing dishes and asked why I was back so soon. I told her I thought I saw something. Immediately, she called my dad and told him to lock all the windows and doors. He was a little tipsy, but he followed her instructions. I slept with her that night. The next morning, we discovered the tent had been torn open. It didn't look like an animal did it. There were no bite marks or claw tears. It seemed like someone had just ripped it apart. My uncle, who lived about a mile away, found all 8 of his chickens dead. Their heads missing but no blood anywhere. For the next few weeks, all the kids had to wait for the bus with an adult, and my dad was late to work for almost 3 weeks. Whenever I tried to bring up what happened, the adults would quickly change the subject, like it wasn't important. But it wasn't until years later that I started to piece things together. I was in my early 20s, telling the story at a Halloween gathering with some cousins. My aunt got really upset, telling me to stop and not to put that kind of evil on anyone. That's when I realized it wasn't just something they wanted to ignore. They were actively avoiding it. Once I got into Reddit, I learned that what I saw had a name, the same name my aunt used at the party. It was the goatman. What bothers me most is that, even now, I can't remember any specific features of the creature, and I've never tasted that awful metallic taste again. So, if you ever find yourself in the foothills of Kentucky, remember my grandma's advice. I grew up in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, about half an hour from a small town called Barberville. The rolling hills and deep valleys of the Appalachian Mountains are ancient, some of the oldest on Earth, with rock formations dating back over 1 billion years. These mountains have existed long before any land animals roamed the planet. As is often the case with things that have been around for so long, there are strange, unexplainable phenomena. Some harmless, others dangerous. Take the Brown Mountain Lights, for instance. I've never felt uneasy or threatened by them when watching from a viewpoint called Old Man's Peak. They aren't good or bad, they just are. On the more peaceful side of things, sometimes you'll walk by an abandoned church near my folks' property and feel this comforting warmth. It's like the first warm day of spring when the sun is perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. But this story isn't about one of those peaceful occurrences. It's about something dark. Around 10 years ago, I was taking night classes in a nearby town, studying auto mechanics. I'd leave work around 2 p.m. and get home by 10:30 p.m., depending on the traffic. Every night, I took the same route in my old Dodge truck, a '76 model. On some nights, the drive got dull, so I'd take the back roads, but on this particular night, I decided to stick to the main highway. It was Thursday, and with no class the next day, I planned to get home, go to bed early, and wake up to hike in the woods at sunrise. As I exited the highway toward the road leading to my parents' place, the night seemed unusually dark. The usual sounds of nature, crickets, frogs, were absent. I've never been one to feel anxious, but something felt off. I pulled up to a stop sign at the exit ramp and noticed the truck stop nearby had no lights on, even though it's open 24/7. I dismissed it as a power outage but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I shifted gears carefully, not wanting to make more noise than necessary, and glanced up at the moon. There were barely any stars, which was odd. Normally, the night skies here are filled with stars, clear enough to see the Milky Way. The absence of stars made the night feel even more wrong. As I came around a sharp left curve and straightened out on the road, I glanced at a decaying barn that I always passed, wondering how long it had stood there and what it must have witnessed over the years. My thoughts were interrupted when a large, sickly dog darted in front of my truck, no more than 10 feet away. My truck was old but solid, though it didn't stop quickly. I slammed on the brakes and felt a fence post in the bed bounce around as I came to a stop. My first thought was that I'd hit the dog and would now have to tell my neighbors, not something people around here take lightly. As I sat there, smelling the burnt rubber from my tires, another scent hit me. The unmistakable stench of rotting flesh. It's a smell you don't forget. I brushed it off, assuming there was a dead animal nearby. I reversed to check on the dog, and in my rearview mirror, lit by my reverse lights, I saw it. But it wasn't a dog anymore. It had stood up on 2 legs, towering over the back of my truck. At first, I didn't fully grasp what I was seeing. The creature was easily over 10 feet tall, and the front of my truck was about 5 feet high. On all fours, it had been massive. Now, standing up, it was even more terrifying. Its skin hung loosely on its thin frame, matted with dirt and patches of fur. One arm seemed longer than the other, both hanging in an unnatural way. As it regained its senses, it turned its head towards my truck, its face partially like a man's, though not fully defined, as if its features were shifting, blurred. There were no eyes, just empty sockets where eyes should have been. Its gray, lifeless skin hung from its face, and the nose was squashed in, resembling a bulldog's. The teeth, though, still haunt me. They weren't arranged naturally. They seemed to spill out of its mouth in all directions, as if trying to escape. For what felt like forever but was probably only seconds, I sat frozen, staring at this thing. Then a light came on at a nearby house, and the creature snapped its head in that direction before sprinting into the woods on its 2 legs, like a person. I floored the gas and drove straight home, my tires screeching as I shifted through gears. When I got there, my parents were asleep. I went down to my room, loaded every gun I owned, and locked every door. I didn't wake them up. Who would believe me? Even the dogs, which usually bark at every little noise, were dead silent that night. The house, which always creaked and groaned, was eerily still. Around 3 a.m., I started to feel drowsy. Just as I was about to lie down, that smell of death crept back in. It started faint, but as I focused on it, it became stronger, filling the entire basement. My dad's office has 2 large glass doors that face a vast forest, and something compelled me to check them. Armed with my shotgun and flashlight, I crept to the doors. When I shined the light through the glass, there it was, standing at the edge of the woods, staring straight into the beam of light. Its eyeless sockets locked onto mine. I covered the flashlight, ran back to the living room, and flipped on the floodlights. But when I looked again, the creature had moved closer, now standing just outside the house. I flung the door open and fired every shot I had. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream, like a woman being tortured, and ran off into the woods. The dog started barking. My parents woke up, and I told them I had scared off a bear. They didn't believe me, but I couldn't tell them the truth. I didn't sleep for days. Things eventually returned to normal, and I put the experience out of my mind until about 6 years later, when I met my wife. Her family lived just a few miles from my parents, and one night we were heading back to their house after a movie. They had a large dog, a Great Pyrenees, who had been quarantined after a run-in with a raccoon. We walked to his kennel to bring him inside, and as we were heading back to the house, I felt that same eerie feeling from years before. Then the smell hit: rotten flesh. My wife joked about the smell, but I knew something was wrong. As we approached the house, we heard barking coming from the kennel, an exact imitation of the Pyrenees, though the Real dog was right next to us. The Pyrenees growled and barked in the direction of the sound, sensing the danger. We ran toward the house, dragging the huge dog with us, and when we reached the safety of the yard, I saw something at the edge of the woods, just outside the range of the floodlights. It bolted back into the darkness. I told my wife the whole story, and the next morning, her sister, a healer with knowledge of Appalachian rituals, came to bless the property. When we reached the dog kennel, it had been destroyed. The concrete cracked, the fence torn down, and the smell of rot lingering. Fast forward a few years, my wife joined the military, and we moved to Delaware. I thought I had left all that behind. But one night, as I was outside playing with the dogs, I smelled it again. The stench of death. One of my dogs, a bulldog, suddenly ran toward the woods, barking ferociously. I grabbed him and rushed back to the house, but the smell grew stronger. I knew it had followed me. I locked the doors, loaded my guns, and waited. That night, the dogs barked nonstop, and I didn't sleep a wink. I don't think I ever will again, at least not while this thing is still out there. In June, my boyfriend, our dog, and I went camping along the Appalachian Trail near a river in Asheville, North Carolina. We had spent the day kayaking and were relaxing at our campsite afterward, preparing for dinner. Our site was only about 10 feet from the trail, with the river just behind it. After a stressful day on the water, we were ready to unwind. We were running low on weed, so we had taken some edibles to relax, as we're regular smokers. My boyfriend was half asleep in his hammock while I was lying on a towel by the river, near our tent. Suddenly, a man came up to us, talking about wanting us to take his trash. At first, I was confused, but then I noticed he was wearing a backpack and an Appalachian Trail shirt, so I realized he was a hiker. He wanted us to carry out his trash, which seemed like a reasonable request, except that we were only a 5-minute walk from civilization. There was a dumpster nearby. I told him this, thinking he'd prefer to dispose of it himself, but then he pulled out a large bag of weed and offered me some if I took his trash. I was a bit puzzled but couldn't pass up free weed, so I agreed. He handed me a small amount of weed, tossed his trash into our bag, and we started making small talk. I asked him if he was hiking the whole trail, and he said he had been on the trail for a couple of months. Then he asked if he could stick around and have a drink with us. I figured he probably just needed some company, and since he seemed normal enough, I said sure. I did suspect that he might have only approached me because he thought I was alone, as he didn't seem to notice my boyfriend in the hammock. When my boyfriend eventually sat up, the hiker looked surprised, confirming that he thought I was by myself. He kept insisting, "Don't worry, I'm not one of those creepy people," which was a little unsettling, but I tried to stay friendly. My boyfriend and I decided to smoke by the river and offered the guy some since he had given us weed. He took a hit, coughed a lot, and that's when things got weird. As stoners, we've seen people act strangely when they get too high, but this guy was on another level. He kept talking, but so quietly that we couldn't make out most of what he was saying. He stared at the river, muttering to himself, and would occasionally look at us like we were part of the conversation. It was awkward and confusing. He also drank at least 3 beers and smoked 2 cigarettes, dragging out his visit for quite a while. At one point, he started talking to Siri on his phone, yelling at her and calling her names. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do I seem like a serial killer?" My boyfriend and I exchanged nervous glances, both of us silently thinking that things had just taken a dark turn. We forced a laugh and said, "Oh, 1. Not at all," trying to keep things light, but inside, we were on edge. After that, I had had enough. I got into the hammock with my boyfriend, and we tried to ignore the guy. He mentioned he was going to smoke 1 more cigarette and then leave, but it felt like the longest cigarette ever. I watched it slowly burn down, just wishing he would go already. Finally, he packed up and left, but it was almost dark, so we knew he wouldn't get far before setting up his camp nearby. That night, we were convinced he might come back to harm us. We heard people walking by on the trail a few times, but it was other hikers we'd seen earlier, including a couple who seemed like they were on drugs and might have been living nearby. We even planned what we would do if he returned: grab the dog and float down the river to the boat ramp downstream. Thankfully, he didn't come back and we never saw him again, but the whole experience really freaked us out. Maybe he was just socially awkward and had been alone in the woods for too long, but there was definitely something off about him. I'm just glad I wasn't alone when he showed up.